the most powerful dynasty in European history, kept meticulous genealogical records going back centuries. They documented every marriage, every alliance, every noble line they absorbed into their family tree. And yet there's a bloodline woven to the Habsburg succession that does not appear in any European record before the turn of the 15th century. No castle, no county, no coat of arms, no prior mention in any chronicle or papal register. It simply appears fully formed at a moment of extraordinary dynastic significance. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. To understand what is strange about the Habsburg genealogical record in the early 15th century, you first have to understand how obsessively European noble houses documented their ancestry. Genealogy in medieval Europe was not a hobby. It was a legal instrument, a property claim, a political weapon, and a religious statement all at once. Every piece of land that changed hands through marriage required documentation of the bloodlines involved. Every succession dispute was settled partly on genealogical grounds. The papal curia maintained its own genealogical records for the purposes of calculating consanguinity, the degree of blood relationship between proposed marriage partners, which required papal dispensation beyond the fourth degree of kinship. The result was a documentation system of extraordinary density. Noble families in Europe by the 13th and 14th centuries were embedded in multiple overlapping record systems simultaneously. They appeared in papal registers, in the records of local monasteries that held their burial rights and memorial obligations, in the imperial chancery, in the records of their feudal overlords, in chronicles maintained at major religious houses, and in the cartularies documenting their own land transactions. A family that actually held land, actually exercised jurisdiction, and actually participated in the political life of the Holy Roman Empire would leave traces in all of these systems independently. The Habsburg family itself illustrates this pattern perfectly. Their origins in the Argo region of what is now Switzerland can be traced through multiple independent record systems back to the 10th century. The castle for which they took their name, the Habsburg, meaning Hawk's castle, appears in contemporary documents. Their early land holdings are documented in monastic cartularies. Their participation in the politics of the Upper Rhine region is recorded in imperial documents. You can trace them step by step to the documentary record, watching the family accumulate land and prestige across 3 centuries before Rudolf of Habsburg became the first Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor in 1273. This is what noble genealogy looked like in medieval Europe. Dense, cross-referenced, multiplier-tested, and above all continuous. The anomaly appears in the context of the Habsburg dynastic consolidation of the early 15th century. By 1400, the Habsburg dynasty had already established itself as one of the premier noble houses of the Holy Roman Empire, controlling the Duchy of Austria and several adjacent territories. But the dynasty faced a persistent structural problem that afflicted every ruling house of the medieval period. The problem of succession continuity, when the male line showed signs of thinning. The particular moment we are examining involves the integration of a family called the Zollern into the extended Habsburg alliance network. The Zollern, who would eventually become the Hohenzollern, and ultimately produce the kings of Prussia and the German emperors of the 19th and 20th centuries, appear in the historical record as a Swabian family of modest but documented origins. Their castle, the Burg Zollern, in what is now Baden-Württemberg, is mentioned in documents from the 11th century, and their genealogy, like the Habsburg genealogy, is dense and continuously attested, but alongside the Zollern integration and documented in the same cluster of dynastic negotiations from the first decade of the 15th century, there are references to a family whose prior history cannot be traced. The name appears in variant spellings across different documents. The geographic origin attributed to them shifts between documents in ways that suggest the scribes recording these negotiations were themselves uncertain about where exactly this family came from. The territorial claim associated with them, a modest lordship somewhere in the eastern reaches of the empire, cannot be located in prior imperial records. This is unusual, not unprecedented, but unusual enough to require explanation. There are several conventional explanations that historians reach for when a family appears in the record without clear prior documentation. The most common is simple archival loss. Medieval archives were vulnerable to fire, flood, warfare, and deliberate destruction. Entire regional archives were lost when monasteries were sacked, when wars burned through administrative centers, or when later administrations simply failed to maintain records that seemed irrelevant to their current concerns. A second conventional explanation is that the family in question was genuinely new, a family elevated from non-noble origins through military service, administrative competence, or simple purchase of a title. The late medieval period saw significant social mobility of this kind. Particularly in the eastern reaches of the empire, where the pressures of frontier expansion created opportunities for men of talent and ambition who lacked noble birth to accumulate the resources necessary for formal enablement. A third explanation, which is less comfortable for historians trained in conventions of nationalist historiography, is that the family came from outside the boundaries of what the record keepers considered Europe. The late medieval period saw a significant integration of families from the Byzantine sphere, from the Armenian diaspora, from the Mongol successor states, and from the Jewish merchant communities of the Eastern Mediterranean into the political and commercial networks of Western and Central Europe. These integrations were often documented in ways that obscured a family's actual origins, partly for social reasons and partly for political ones. Each of these explanations has been applied to different aspects of the Habsburg genealogical record in the early 15th century. None of them is fully satisfying for reasons that the documentary evidence itself makes clear. The revisionist economic history perspective on this question begins not with the genealogical records themselves, but with the financial records of the early Habsburg court. What the financial records show, particularly the accounts of the Habsburg treasury from approximately 1380 to 1420, is a pattern of capital influx that does not correspond to any documented inheritance, military victory, or territorial acquisition during the same period. The Habsburg treasury in the late 14th century was, by the standards of the major European courts, and modestly funded. The dynasty controlled productive agricultural territories, had access to some silver mining revenue from their alpine territories, and collected the customary dues from their feudal dependents. But their financial position was constrained by the cost of maintaining a ducal court, funding military campaigns against the Swiss Confederation, which had been successfully asserting its independence from Habsburg overlordship since the late 13th century, and managing the complex inheritance disputes that periodically divided the dynasty against itself. Then beginning in approximately the 1390s and accelerating to the first decade of the 15th century, the Habsburg court accounts show a series of transactions that presuppose access to capital substantially larger than the dynasty's documented revenue sources would support. The construction projects undertaken during this period, the diplomatic gifts exchanged with other courts, the scale of the marriage negotiations being conducted simultaneously on multiple fronts. All of these activities require a financial foundation that the prior records do not explain. This is the economic historian's entry point into the genealogical question, because the most consistent source of large capital concentrations in late medieval Europe that left minimal paper trails in conventional noble record systems was the merchant diaspora of the Eastern Mediterranean. Families whose wealth had been accumulated through longue distanciance trade, whose financial instruments operate across multiple political jurisdictions simultaneously, and whose integration into European noble networks was routinely obscured by the genealogical fictions that made such integration socially acceptable. To understand why a family of Eastern Mediterranean merchant origin would lack prior documentation in European noble records while still possessing substantial capital, it is necessary to understand the financial geography of the late medieval world. The long-distance trade networks that connected the Eastern Mediterranean to the markets of Northern and Western Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries were among the most sophisticated economic systems that had yet existed. They involved credit instruments that could transfer value across thousands of miles without physical movement of currency, partnership structures that pulled capital from multiple investors while limiting individual liability, and information networks that gave their participants advanced knowledge of price movements, political disruptions, and commercial opportunities. These networks were maintained by several overlapping merchant communities. The Venetian and Genoese commercial empires are the most extensively documented because both cities maintained state-level bureaucracies that generated dense records. But alongside the Italian city-states and often operating in the same markets, Quam were merchant communities whose record keeping was primarily internal to their own communities rather than integrated with the documentation systems of European states. The Jewish merchant communities of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Armenian trading diaspora that connected the markets of Persia and Central Asia to the ports of the Levant, and the Greek merchant families of the declining Byzantine Empire, all participated in these networks with sophistication equal to or exceeding that of the Italian city-states, but with far less integration into the documentary systems that European historians have traditionally used to trace economic history. Their wealth could be very large. Their visibility in the conventional European record could be very small. When families from these communities sought integration into European noble society, the process was typically managed through a combination of religious conversion, selective genealogical construction, and strategic marriage into families of modest but documented noble origin. The result was a new family that had a European genealogy, however recently constructed, and capital resources that could be explained as the inheritance from that European genealogy without anyone asking too carefully about the actual origins of the money. The specific case of the unattested bloodline in the Habsburg alliance network of the early 15th century shows several characteristics consistent with this pattern. The family appears with capital resources that are disproportionate to their supposed territorial base. The territorial claim associated with them, though it cannot be verified in prior records, is located in a region of the empire where archival coverage was genuinely sparse, making absence of prior documentation less immediately suspicious than it would be in better documented regions. The marriage alliance they contracted with the Habsburg network was structured in ways that gave them significant financial claims while giving the Habsburgs access to capital without requiring the formal acknowledgement of a large loan which would have had its own documentary and political implications. There is also the matter of what happened to this family in subsequent generations. The pattern of later Habsburg genealogical documentation systematically backstops this family's history in ways that are characteristic of deliberate genealogical construction rather than genuine historical recovery. Documents purporting to trace the family's ancestry appear in the 15th century written in styles and using formulaic conventions that are inconsistent with genuinely contemporaneous documentation from the periods they claim to describe. This kind of retrospective genealogical construction was not uncommon in the medieval period, but it is specifically common in cases where a family needed to establish a paper history that their actual origins could not provide. The economic consequences of this integration are what make it significant from the revisionist economic history perspective. The capital that entered the Habsburg orbit through this alliance network in the early 15th century appears to have been instrumental in the dynasty's subsequent expansion. The purchase of the Duchy of Tyrol in 1363 had already given the Habsburgs control of crucial Alpine transit routes. But the full exploitation of that geographic position required capital investment in road infrastructure, garrison maintenance, and the administrative apparatus necessary to collect transit tolls efficiently. The documentation of Habsburg infrastructure investment in the Alpine passes shows a marked acceleration in the first decades of the 15th century. New toll stations appear. Existing roads are documented as being upgraded. The administrative records of the Italian territories show an expansion of the fiscal apparatus that presupposes both capital investment and the administrative expertise to design efficient toll collection systems. Neither of these resources, the capital or the expertise, is fully explained by the Habsburgs' documented domestic revenue and their own administrative tradition. Long-distance merchant networks, by contrast, had extensive experience in exactly this kind of infrastructure investment. The management of transit points, the design of toll collection systems that maximize revenue while minimizing the friction that drove merchants to seek alternative routes, the financial instruments necessary to fund infrastructure before the revenue from began to flow. All of these were core competencies of the merchant diaspora families whose capital was being integrated into European noble structures throughout the late medieval period. The acceleration of Habsburg infrastructure investment in the Alpine region in the early 15th century looks in economic terms like the application of merchant expertise and merchant capital to a geographic asset that the Habsburgs controlled politically, but had not previously been able to exploit at full commercial efficiency. There is a broader pattern in European dynastic history of the 14th and 15th centuries that the Habsburg case exemplifies but did not initiate. The financial pressures of the late medieval crisis, a century of plague, warfare, agrarian contraction, and monetary disruption that reduced the revenue of land-based noble families across Europe, created powerful incentives for dynasties to seek capital from sources outside the conventional noble economy. The most visible form of this was straightforward royal borrowing from Italian merchant banks. The English crown's borrowing from the Bard and Peruti banking houses in the mid-4th century is the most famous example, ending in the spectacular bankruptcies that destroyed both banking houses when Edward III defaulted on his loans in 1345. But the catastrophic visibility of that failure made subsequent arrangements more circumspect. Noble families seeking external capital increasingly structured their relationships with merchant capital in ways that made the transaction look like something other than a loan, a marriage alliance, a partnership in a commercial venture, a grant of trading privileges, or a genealogical integration that made the merchant family nominally part of the noble family network. The Habsburg dynasty was particularly sophisticated in its use of these alternative structures, a sophistication that would reach its fullest expression in the financial arrangements of the 16th century, when the dynasty's relationship with the Fugger banking family of Habsburg would become the financial engine of the largest empire the world had yet seen. But the patterns that made the Fugger relationship possible, the willingness to integrate merchant capital through quasi-familial structures, the construction of genealogical frameworks that gave merchant families access to noble networks, the use of geographic control points to monetize transit rather than territory. All of these were being developed in the early 15th century in the very transactions that produced the unattested bloodline in the Habsburg alliance network. The question of what the unattested bloodline actually represents, what family concealed, what geographic and ethnic origin it obscured, is ultimately less important than the question of what its presence tells us about how the Habsburg dynasty actually financed its rise. The standard account of Habsburg power emphasizes dynastic marriage as a mechanism of territorial expansion, captured in the famous phrase attributed to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary about the Habsburgs letting others wage war while they themselves married. This account is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that the financial records reveal. The marriages that brought territorial expansion also brought capital. The capital came from sources that the genealogical record was systematically constructed to obscure. The obscuration was not accidental or the product of archival loss. It was deliberate. Hags maintained across multiple generations by a dynasty that understood very precisely where its money actually came from, and had strong reasons for ensuring that the official record told a different story. This is revisionist economic history, in its most basic sense, not a revision of the political narrative, which remains substantially accurate as far as it goes, but a revision of the economic foundation on which the political narrative rested. The Habsburgs did not rise to dominate Europe because they were particularly clever at dynastic marriage, though they were. They rose because they found a way to access capital from the most sophisticated financial networks in the late medieval world, while constructing a genealogical record that made this access invisible to both their contemporaries and to subsequent historians. The unattested bloodline that appears in the Habsburg alliance network in the early 15th century is one trace of this process. It is not the only trace. The financial records, the infrastructure investment patterns, the structure of the commercial privileges granted to specific merchant communities in Habsburg territories, and the genealogical backstopping that appears in 15th century documentation all converge on the same conclusion. The Habsburgs married into something that the record was not allowed to describe accurately. What it was, the economic historian can reconstruct from the financial evidence, even when the genealogical record has been deliberately obscured. The legacy of this pattern extends far beyond the Habsburg dynasty itself. The mechanism the early Habsburgs developed for integrating merchant capital through quasi-genealogical structures became the standard operating procedure of European dynastic finance. The willingness to construct genealogical fictions, to grant trading privileges that made capital access look like commercial arrangement rather than debt, and to invest merchant expertise in geographic control points that transformed political power into financial power, all spread from the Austrian core outward to the other major dynasties of early modern Europe. The Fugger relationship that sustained Habsburg power in the 16th century was possible because the institutional framework for managing that kind of relationship had been developed over the preceding century. The financial instruments, the legal structures, the genealogical conventions, and above all the political will to maintain the fiction of purely noble dynastic power while actually running a hybrid noble merchant financial system. All of these have been worked out in the smaller scale transactions of the early 15th century. When historians discuss the birth of capitalism in Europe, they typically focus on the commercial republics of Italy and the Low Countries. But the financial history of the dynastic monarchies suggests that the integration of merchant capital into nominally non-commercial political structures was equally important. The dynasties did not simply borrow money from merchants. They absorbed merchant capital, merchant knowledge, and in some cases merchant families into their own institutional structures while maintaining the fiction of a purely noble order. The unattested bloodline in the Habsburg record is a small trace of a very large process. It is a seam in the genealogical fiction where the actual history briefly became visible before the document makers close it over. Following that seam does not merely revise one dynasty's history. It revises a history of how European power actually worked in the transition from the medieval to the early modern world. And that is the story the Habsburg genealogical record does not want you to find. A bloodline with no European past, capital with no noble origin, and a dynasty whose real financial history was buried under layers of deliberate documentation designed to make the medieval world look simpler and purer than it ever actually was. The Habsburgs did not simply marry for land. They married for money. And the money came from places the record was never supposed to name.